Hey everybody, welcome to another lovely little episode of AP US History with Mr. Musak. We're going to focus the next video or two on slavery in the United States and during period 4, this time 1800 1844, how slavery expands. So let's start with this map right here, ladies and gentlemen. You can see your our vision of the South here. And by 1850, going a little bit outside our timeline here, but by 1850 you can see what slaves are slave states, what slaves are free states, and how some of them have grown. Here's our original slave states we had, okay? And by 1821, we add Kentucky and Tennessee, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Missouri. And then going on from that, we add Florida, Arkansas, and Texas after that. And so you can see how the original 6 states is 6 more, and then 3 more after that by 1850. By 1850, there are 15 slave states in the country. Now remember, Missouri Compromise, don't forget this rule, our 3630 line says slavery would not go past this line going forward, which is kind of a scary thing for the South in terms of the equality of free and slave states with all this unorganized territory up here and the question of new states being developed all the time. And so all the new states up here, except for Missouri, would now become free states. And so it's a big question to keep back in mind as we look at slave policy going forward. Of course, the idea that fugitive slaves would be brought back to the South was part of this agreement. So here's how we see some of the characteristics of the antebellum South. Now, first off, this word antebellum is important. Know this word. If you are not watching this, you're not going to get this. But antebellum refers to the period of time prior to the Civil War. So we're talking 1830s up to about Civil War time is called the antebellum South. And so if you know the country group Lady Antebellums, where they come from, explain this kind of time. So antebellum South always going to be prior to the Civil War. So prior to the Civil War, our antebellum South period is very agrarian. Okay, still agrarian, still focused on cash crops, but power has now shifted. Originally, remember, during the colonial times, this was tobacco and those kind of things up in Virginia. It has now changed. The upper South and lower South have kind of switched power. So now power has shifted from up here in Virginia. I'm going to flip back one slide. Yep, okay. Up here, tobacco country, down to cotton country. So the lower South now down here. Mississippi, Alabama, this area is a cotton country. Eventually go to Texas. That will be the new powerhouse of the United States going forward during this antebellum time. Remember, cotton is king, ladies and gentlemen. We talked about this a little bit earlier this year that cotton is the crop now for the South. We'll talk more about this, and that by 1860, going through period 5. The United States is putting out 5 million bales of cotton per year, and it's over half all the U.S. exports. So we are really dependent upon growing cotton and sending cotton out. With this whole focus on agriculture, especially cotton production, there's very, very little industrialization happening in the South, and the financial system is not very advanced, very rudimentary banking system, nothing fancy, and also a very inadequate transport. Few roads, few canals. Not a lot of canals being built. Even railroads aren't really being built a lot in the South. Still relying on Mississippi River traffic, and very rudimentary roads going forward. So here's our Southern Slave Society, the antebellum South, prior to 1850. Your very top part, about 6 million people, are your Caucasian Americans. So you have your slaveocracy in the very top, which is very number of the big plantation owners, the very, very rich people, and then you have a bigger chunk of plain folk. These are small white yeoman farmers who have their little farm out back. They may be slave owners yet. Okay, they may have 1 or 2 slaves that are working on their small farm, but overall, that's your one side of it. Going forward, then you have the black freemen, which will be 20,000 free blacks living in the South. Yes, there were free African Americans living in the South, and then your 3.2 million black slaves. So by 1850, we're talking 23 million people in the United States. About 9.2 million are Southern, and about half, about a third of that is slaves. Okay, so something to think about as it goes forward that way. Now, a lot of changes happened in slavery during this time period. So, 1808, as according to the Constitution, you can no longer import slaves from other countries. So the outside slave trade is now gone. But selling and buying slaves throughout the country is still okay yet. This is where the term being sold downriver comes. Typically, treatment was harsher for slaves the farther south you got. The work was hard, all that kind of stuff. So one threat done by a lot of slave owners was to, quote unquote, sell you downriver, that river being the Mississippi River. And so a lot of slave transactions happened all around the slave states, from the north to the south, trading slaves and buying, selling slaves back and forth. Like I said, remember, the economy is all about the southern farming, And there's this fugitive slave law existed since 1793, and it kind of revised and strengthened in 1820 and 1850 that Northerners are required to help capture runaway slaves and bring them home. So just leaving the slave states does not mean now that you are necessarily out of slavery. Now in the South, we see two different types of slavery. We see the rural slave, which lived on the farms, the plantations, whether it be a small farm or a big plantation we have. So there they would do either housework or farm work, so work in the fields, planting, picking cotton, or other crops, where it might be, doing the weeding, all those kind of things would be part of it, or housework. So it could be more in the house doing chores, taking care of children, where it might be that way. You also have urban slavery, where you have urban slaves in some of the cities like Baltimore and Richmond and Charleston, the bigger cities, especially the bigger coastal cities, where you may have specialized skills to learn plantations. So some slaves also learn how to blacksmith or be carpenters, that kind of stuff on plantations. Or they may work in factories, they may work on ships, and almost are hired out to different companies by their owners. In rural slavery, we're kind of focusing on this part first. You can kind of see where we have that vision. We get a lot about slavery. So a lot of times plantation, where you self-contained cities centered around that big center house. You have the slave quarters, you have the main barns, outbuildings, those kind of things. And slaves required to work dusk till dawn. Their day started when the sun came up. Their night was done when the sun went down. And so you'd be expected to be working that entire time. And typically, it's seen a little sketchy. There's the overseer or a slave driver, whether it be white or there could be a slave whose job it was to make slaves work and work faster, whether it be through violence or threats or whatever it might be. Their job was to make people work and make sure the jobs got done that day. And I said, not all these jobs are always farming or working out in the fields or harvesting or planting or weeding, where it might be. Some slaves had very specific skills. Some were working in lumbering, cutting out trees and cutting wood, that kind of stuff. Some were blacksmiths. Some were carpenters. Other people had other specialized jobs that did exist. So there were skills that were being taught and were being learned by a lot of slaves in some of these other places. And those who were in the quote-unquote house slaves might be cooking or cleaning or nannying children, or taking care of children, doing everything else that kind of was part of their life. So here we see the states. We can kind of see the different percentages going here from slave and free. So you can kind of tell that the farther north you get, there's a smaller percentage of African American slaves, or free African Americans for that matter. And down here you see a much bigger percentage, where African Americans make up a bigger or almost as much a number of people in the states, especially down here in the deep south. So most of our free African Americans live in the northern part of the south, so Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina. I live in Louisiana, though that existed from before Louisiana became part of the United States. Other states, had very, 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 very few free African Americans. Now, looking where our agriculture was being grown down here, you notice that in the south down here, this is our short fiber cotton. This is going to be the cotton belt right down here, starting North Carolina, rolling right down through Alabama, Mississippi, eventually into Texas as well. Other places, still have the tobacco farms of Virginia, a little bit in Kentucky, the corn farms that still exist here as well, and you also do have some of that, the Sea Island kind of areas doing some rice, those kind of things in South Carolina. But overall, really, it's only a few types of goods and stuff that are being grown here. This cotton belt is one of the main things that we see happening. You do see things like in Kentucky, the hemp farms, Kentucky. You have some manufacturing in Richmond and Georgia, but other than that, not much going on that way. Here is our area of cotton production. Notice you kind of see this little beige area is our cotton areas, and notice that a lot of times slavery is kind of a little bit denser in those cotton growing areas, because it was such cotton called for a very, very rich soil, need a lot of very goods, that kind of stuff, and it was a very labor intensive crop, causing the need for a lot of slave labor in the South to harvest and pick that crop. Notice cotton is definitely our biggest export we have here, so you can kind of see as we go forward here in 1840, 1860, that cotton is still our biggest export crop leaving the country. So versus tobacco or versus corn, where it might be, cotton is truly king. Cotton was what we were basing most of our exports off, that we were sending off to Europe and other areas. You kind of see our slave labor work here, for what kind of work slaves did. Over half of slaves worked in cotton production, whereas you see the next biggest one is domestic work, and then the rice, sugar, and hemp, tobacco, and the mining and more urban type labors that existed. You see images of slaves that are working, picking cotton. Different jobs had to be done. It had to be weeded, it had to be hoed, it had to be taken care of that way. You saw little cotton balls that are out here. So that harvesting involved literally picking individual cotton balls off these little plants and putting them into bags and bales to be then cotton gin and that kind of stuff. You see the African Americans using the cotton gin, so putting in the raw cotton from the field and running it through the cotton gin. Obviously, the cotton gin made this process a lot faster, a lot easier, and encouraged more southern farmers to start growing cotton, then needing expanding the use of slavery. So here we got kind of, you can see 1820 where cotton is being grown. This is in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, a little bit down here in Alabama, in 1860. So we call this Alabama fever. Essentially, a lot of people rushed and moved to Alabama, Mississippi, because they wanted to grow cotton. And so you saw a huge emigration throughout the South to the southern areas down here to move down here. Because they want to jump on this huge cotton trend. So buy a big chunk of land up, start planting cotton, and make money off it. So it was kind of seen as the money making activity, the money making deal to kind of make to strike it rich. You can see again here. Here's our value of cotton versus exports and how much cotton became really important to the U.S. economy. So like I said, cotton is king. You can see how much cotton was being hauled in 1 week. You see being moved here by the slaves doing different jobs, whether it be driving the animals or carrying stuff. Obviously, a whole family working in this, doing different jobs, existing in this William Henry Brown painting. And we see, notice again as we go forward here, 1860, where cotton production is and where slavery is as well. Now, in some of the bigger cities like Charleston, Savannah, going through Richmond, Virginia, D.C., parts of Delaware, and Maryland, you had urban slavery as well. And we'll talk about Frederick Douglass later on, but Frederick Douglass was both a field slave and an urban slave in his life. And he also wrote a very famous book about his life as a literate man. And he called himself, when he became an urban slave living in Maryland, he called himself almost a free man, is what he called himself. He said, by being an urban slave, it felt like I was a free man because, he could be hired out to factories and shops, a lot of different jobs. He was taught to read while he was an urban slave by the person who was working for his wife. And it felt a lot more free and had a lot more freedom than if otherwise. The clothing was better, the food was better, all things are different there. The acts of cruelty you found, the whippings, that kind of beatings we'll look at in a second, weren't as prevalent in the urban areas as they were in the rural areas for those who worked as slaves there. Now you did have some attempts industry. So we talk about where industry was happening in the north in the 18-teens and 1820s. The first factory doesn't come till 1845, right? It's in South Carolina to build a textile mill using slave labor. Here we see sugar boiling is not one of those type of both agricultural and maybe looking at some more industrial type work being done by slaves in the South. Now looking at see how people held slaves, it's kind of a misnomer to everyone in the South owned slaves. Because honestly, about 2/3 of Southerners owned absolutely no slaves whatsoever. And then looking at the breakdown here, it's only a very small number of Southerners who owned more than 50 slaves, like Andrew Jackson. So you see, 18%, owned about 5 or fewer. These are small, very, very small yeoman farmers. You have the 15.5% owning 5 to 50, your small plantation owners, and your huge plantation owners. Very, very few people were that. Here's how you show African American population. You have your slave tag. So this is where you're required to wear a slave badge. And so this would tell you, that you are a slave, where you live, who you belong to, all that kind of stuff. Really funny is that there's a liberty cap on here. Liberty cap means freedom. I don't get that one personally, but so you have the name of whoever owns the owner on this badge should identify who owns the person and where they're traveling in different places like that. Now, there's a lot of actually pro-slavery arguments made during this time by Southerners. It was in the Revolution era. They said, they found they used the Bible and also classical Greece and Roman areas as their justification. That there's slavery in the Bible, it means it's okay. Ancient Greek, ancient Rome, these are the most civilized people out there. They had slavery, it means it's okay. There also be arguments that we were civilizing people, and civilizing people didn't know better kind of stuff, right? In our viewpoint of it. So religion, English being taught, and the Constitution recognized slavery, so slavery was seen as property. They were seen as that chattel slavery, and so it almost became property rights. And so the Missouri Compromise, when passed 1820, really scares Southerners about what they're doing. We're gonna leave you off with this pro-slavery propaganda piece here, where it shows an African person in their own country versus in America, and that argument they're being made. We'll see this later on.